I am by day an academic in Jewish studies, so I'm going to inflict some academia on you very briefly because I think it's important for thinking about what's going on in this section. So one of the kind of through lines I saw in all of these sources on Melicha is a tension between kind of accepted practice or even just like occasional anecdotal practice and the textual sources of halacha. And so I think there's a kind of push and pull going on throughout the sources we saw. And there are even some moments where we see like gender playing into that, at least to some degree. So I found myself thinking back to this very important essay, historical essay by Chaim Soloveitchik, which tries to understand the changes in Jewish practice in modernity as being basically a debate about two options. One option is trying to find a way to harmonize the textual practices and the lived like kind of minhag, and one way of doing that is just to kind of erase minhag wherever it appears, and one way is to kind of find harmony or just demand that the texts work with the minhag. And one of the things that he identifies is that often minhag can be very conservative. It can be very kind of, can go beyond, it can be very chomertic, it can go beyond what halachic sources say. And in fact, kashrut is a kind of key player in that. So I wanted to read this just because I think it's like a good framing to have in the back of our heads as we go on and read the sources. So if someone want to read in English, this is your moment to pick easy reading. Okay, I'm going to make someone read. Alice, go ahead.
Best for English. Okay, great.
Sorry.
Did these mimetic norms, the culturally prescriptive, conform to the legal ones? The answer is at times yes, at times no. And the significance of the no may best be brought home by an example with which all are familiar. The kitchen, which is rigid separation of milk and meat. Separate dishes, sinks, dish racks, towels, tablecloths, even separate cupboards. Actually, little of this has a basis in halakha. Strictly speaking, there is no need for separate sinks, or separate dish towels or cupboards. In fact, if the food is served cold, there's no need for separate dishware at all. The simple fact is that the traditional Jewish kitchen, transmitted from mother to daughter over generations, has been immeasurably and unrecognizably amplified beyond all halachic requirements. Its classic contours are the product not of legal exegesis, but of the housewife's religious intuition impaired in kitchen apprenticeship.
Okay, so just stop there for 1 second. So like part of what's going on here is an assumption that the mimetic is kind of the realm of women and the text is the realm of men. And I think we'll see some examples today that will either convince you that that way of setting things up is correct, or maybe convince you that that way of setting things up is incomplete. But the more chomertic side is the side that actually has no connection to text at all. Okay, I don't think we need to read all of this, but I just want you to see that if we're looking for a certain kind of accuracy, we're going to find that accuracy, quote unquote, in text, because custom, as he says, is potent, but its true power is informal. So it's only when habit just kind of gets the book knowledge into your head that then custom starts to become really powerful. So I want to think about that. If you want later, you can click on this link, which is a link to a project at Hebrew led by Elisheva Baumgarten about looking for ways of actually getting at medieval Jewish daily life and seeing if there are ways to kind of understand where these mimetic practices might come from that isn't just sort of saying, well, the version of mimetic practices that we have is a version of just like these crazy women and their housewife religious intuition, but in fact is a more varied and complicated kind of phenomenon that's in relationship of women and men, relationship of Jews and Christians, all of that kind of stuff. So those are just some like broad framing kinds of ideas that I want to have in the back of our heads. Now I think we can jump into the sources themselves. So last week with Rav Lexi, at least from what I saw on the recording, it seemed like you looked at this first Gemara in Chulin, but I think maybe let's read it again anyway, because this one, and then we'll skip the Ran etc. And then this one, and then the second one in Chulin Kuf Yud Bet are really the two main Gemaras that are in the background for these questions about salting. Aaron, can I get you to read this Gemara in Chulin Sadid Zayin?
Hanehu et mata di'im lichu beirish galuta begida nashia. Ravina asar. Rav Acha bar Rav Ashi share at Rav Acha bar Rav Ashi share ati sheluha lamar bar Rav Ashi.
Okay. So
Do
you want to just describe
sorry.
Sorry, was I muted the whole time or no?
You were not muted the whole time, but we sort of stopped in a weird place. So, right, Rav Acha bar Rav Ashi Share. There should be a period there. So maybe you can just describe the case and what's going on here.
They're bringing. I forget if what atmata was. I think it was a salted fish.
I think it's a thigh.
Oh, right. That with Gita Nasha in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Ravina said it is Asur. Rav Acha bar Rav Ashi said it is mutar.
They salted it. The key point is they salted it in that
The
state.
key point is they salt them in that state with the Gita Nasha input in it. And then the question is, does the salting affect some kind of flavor transfer or something from the Gid to the rest of the beet or not? Right? Is the salting enough to affect some kind of transfer? Okay, then they're going to go and ask Mar bar Rav Ashi the question about this case.
Atu shailuha Mar bar Rav Ashi. Amar lahu abashare. Amar le Rav Acha bar Rav Ravina. Maidatech. Amar Shmuel maliach harehu karoteach kavush harehu kamavushal. Hava Amar Shmuel lo shanu elashnit bashalba. Aval nitzlaba kolef ocha ashmagi lagid. Right. So they asked Mar bar Rav Ashi, what's going on here? And Rav Acha bar Rav said to Ravina, what do you think about this? And Shmuel said maliach is like roteach and kavush is like mavushal. So the question is malicha.
So in that, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, right. To what degree is malicha actually like roteach?
Right. So if you just had Shmuel, if you just have maliachu keroteach kavushu kemevushal, what would you think about this case with the thigh with the Gita Nasha that's been salted in it?
It should be asur.
Right. Or at least you should have to treat it like, yeah. It should, let's assume, right? It depends what we think roteach is, but if we think roteach is, so you might, well, let's say this, you might have the following problem. What's the difference between saying something is kiroteach and something is kimivusha? We might think those are the same thing, but then why are we using different words? So we need to kind of come up with a more precise definition. Because if you thought that maybe roteach is like tzli, which is like where we're going to be headed, then maybe you would say not that the whole thing is asur, but that you can cut down to it just in the same case on all of that, just as we had in all the cases we saw last week. Okay, so finish it off.
V'ha'amar Shmuel lo shanu ela shenitbashel ba aval nitzlaba kolef ocha ad shemageh lagid. But didn't Shmuel say that's only the case when it's actually cooked in it, or cooked together? But if it's roasted, you just cut to the gid and take it out.
Great. Right. So Yavni says it's more poetic when you use those words. Yeah, it's more poetic, and I think it also it rhymes and it's easier to remember, right? Maliach hu keroteach, like right, the repetition of the consonantal sounds like makes it easier to kavush mevushal, makes it easier to hear. But we're going to draw some kind of potential halachic implication from that.
My karoteach de ka'amar karoteach de mevushal v'hami de ka'amar kavush haru kavush harim kamavushal miklal de roteach de tzli ka'amar kasha. And if you say, what is karoteach? Is it the sort of karoteach that's like mavushal? Well, from the fact that it says kavush is like kamavushal, is like mavushal, roteach must be like something else, so it must be like tzli. In this kasha stance.
Great. So we can't just say that it's asur totally. We're going to say something else. Okay. That's a basic Gemara. I think in a lot of ways, it's like surprisingly, in certain ways straightforward and in certain ways very confusing. And I think we'll see kind of the diversity of what ends up with it as we go on. I think we saw this run last week, so let's press on to the next sugya, unless there are people who have things they want to say about this.
What halachic conclusion are you getting from this?
What do people think?
I mean, it seems pretty right. You have a tradition of Rav Ashi, a little bit, yeah. Rav Ashi uses a share, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have a kasha against the idea that it's roteach is tzali is this means that maliach is roteach kim vushal. It must be roteach of sali. So it sounds like it shouldn't be asur. It should be at best kolef, right?
Yeah, right. Because at minimum, like the most, right, you're going to get the most you're going to get is this opinion that says if it's like tzali, then it's kolev. But and the other opinion is just it's permitted altogether, right?
Yeah. So
right. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Joel.
The same thing.
Okay, great. Right. So it seems like this should just be permitted, or it should be at minimum tzli. But we'll see that the story gets more roundabout as we go on.
I mean, we haven't included, questions about mifafeh here at all, and that's going to be the,
Right. So we haven't seen anything about what's mifafeh when. It's just this one, and we haven't seen anything about geometry. Right. That's the other thing that we're going to see in a minute. Like this case just has the gid in the thigh. Soon we're going to get into questions of like tatagvar and which thing is salted and which thing is not. So that's, or a salty thing and a not salty thing together. So the cases will get more complicated as we go. And then that will potentially like lead us to need to draw distinctions and inferences about like how broadly we can apply this like seemingly very permissive approach. Great. Anybody else? Cool. All right. Jess or Michael, do you want to read this Gemara? Okay, fight it out, guys. Go ahead.
Do you want it?
Sure. Rav Mari bar Rachel, imlech lebasa shchuta, bahade basa toifa, atal lekame de Rava. Amale, hatmeim lasot siran votfan, vekipash shlahen. Lemale, midishmul damashmul, melech harehu roteach, ukvush harehu mavishal. Midishmul haver mina hane mile deman. Aval tsiran votfan, lo kamashmela.
Okay, let's stop there. Go back and spell things out for us.
Okay, so Rav, I'm just trying to see on the computer. Rav Mari bar Rachel, salted slaughtered meat with treif meat, like kosher meat with treif meat, and the case came before Rava. And he said the tamei things to forbid their brine and gravy and all of their things. And we're like, well, what about that thing that Shmuel said, where we said that like salting is like boiling, and therefore, you would expect it to be asur from that instead. And we say, no, because that wouldn't include their brine and their gravy, and so on.
right? So the prince, sorry, somebody said something, but it got kind of distorted. No, nobody said anything. Okay, great. So, right, this principle of Shmuel, you might think that the principle of Shmuel is enough, and or rather, why are you going to this pasuk? You already have a principle of Shmuel, but in fact, that principle is not sort of sufficient to get us all of these different things that would be asur. All right, keep going. Meitve.
Dagtahu shemalchu im dagtamei mutar. Mein lav shehayu shnehen meluchin lo kegon shehaya taho melech v'tamei tafer.
Why don't you stop there? Stop there for a second.
Okay, so we've got a Bryce that disagrees, which is the Tosefta we had at the top of the source sheet, which is that kosher fish that was salted with non-kosher fish it's mutar, which seems to contradict. And then we say, no, these cases are different, because in that case, it's not actually that they were both salted. It must have been that the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish was unsalted.
Just spell out for me why might you think that case would have a different gene than the two things being salted together? Just like kind of common sense reasoning.
Well, you might think that if salting does some kind of drawing out of the flavors, then so long as the non-kosher fish is not salted, then there will be no drawing out of unkosher flavor, and so the trafiness will not be contagious.
Great, beautiful. Okay, keep going.
V'ha mikatane sefer miklal dereisha b'sheshnehem melochin askinan pershe kamafaresh tahor shnalchu im daktmei mutar ketzad shehaya tahor meliach v'tamei tafer achanam mistabra de'isal kadar tacharesh shnehem melochim hashta shnehem melochim sharei tahor meliach v'tamei tafer mibai mishum ha'irya Tana sefer legalui resha delot hema resha tahor meliach v'tamei tafer. Aval shnehem meluchim asor. Tana sefer tahor meliach v'tamei tafer miklal de resha shnehem meluchim v'afilu hachi sharei tashma misefer de sefer aval im haya tamei meliach v'tahor tafer asur tamei meliach v'tahor tafer hu da'asor. Hashnehen meluchim sharei aide de tana resha tahor meliach u'tamei tafer tanana mesefer tamei meliach v'tahor tafer.
Okay, great. That's a tongue twister, but let's go back through it and just spell it out.
Great. Okay. Finding the place again. Okay. So the sefer here about the unsalted tray fish comes from the general principle of the Reisha, in which we're now positing does deal with two salted fishes, both of them being salted, because you say that if a kosher fish was salted with a non-kosher fish, sorry, I'm losing place. It's been too long since I read this the first time. Okay, so yeah, so you've got your kosher fish salted with your non-kosher fish. And then I'm trying to remember how this ketzad works. That
Can I jump in for a second here? Is that okay?
go for it, yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to, right, because we say, wait a second, if that means the resha must be when they're both meluchim, we say no, parushe kamefarish. The sefer is coming to explain the resha. It's not going to be a different case in the resha. right? And therefore, right, so then we say, how does, we say the ratio is, right, tahor shmalchuim dag tamem mutar, ketzad, what's the case? Then the seifa comes in. That one is maliach, the tahor is maliach, and the tameh is tafel. So that's how it's trying to explain that the seifa is explaining the ratio, not being a different case than the ratio, essentially. Is that helpful?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's very helpful. Great. So we now know that we've now able to read to say, right, that these two, that the seifa is just explaining the resha. Okay, and then we're at hachinami mistabra.
Okay, so I say, well, this is reasonable from this proof that we can bring, because if you should think that in the ratio they're both salted, then you would think that both of them salted would be permitted. So we need to bring this case where the tahor one is salted and the tameh one is unsalted.
Well, I think it's more that we need to interpret the resha as talking about that, because otherwise we might think like we have to read the resha that way. We can't read it the way that like plain reading seems to be, that there is like they're both salted together.
Yeah, I mean, right, because the mibai is a question there, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't need to have the seifa.
Right, it would be extraneous.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. So, and then we have so, well, because of that, then we don't need this, because then it's that the seifa is for when it's sorry, this copy doesn't have my notes. I've got a bit of a problem with all my books being in the wrong places at the moment. Galui here is just like,
Right. The seifa is coming to explain to like clarify or explain the resha.
okay, so the seifa is coming to explain the resha, that we wouldn't say that the resha is about a kosher salted and unkosher not unsalted. Rather, we're saying the ratio is about both of them being salted, and that would be a sur. And then the seifa teaches us that when the kosher one is salted and the unkosher one is unsalted, which is in the kind of like, from the general principle of the ratio, we would say maybe even this is permitted. And we learn from the seifa that it's not.
Right. So just to track what's happened, right, we've entertained the idea that the seifa is merely coming to explain or clarify what the resha case was, and now we've kind of rejected that reading and said no, that actually the resha seems to really be about two salted fish, and the seifa is bringing a different case, which is about one salted and one non-salted. Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Should we finish it off?
Okay. So when you have a salted tameh fish and an unsalted kosher fish, then that would forbid both, because yes, and when the two, and this one where both of them are salted, that might be permitted. I'm not sure why I'm getting it. Because the ratio taught that if the pure one is salted and the impure one is unsalted, and the seifa also taught of the impure one being salted, and like you can infer from the seifa what's the case of the tameh one being salted and the.
Well, the seifa just is describing that case, right? Yes. It's not, yeah. Lexi, did you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think right at the end, it's trying to use this to prove that it must be only the case of the tameh, maliach, and tahor tafel where there's an iser, but shneim meluchin isn't dafka because it said tamei maleach v'tahor tafel, right? But like the shnei meluchin, that should be permitted because like that's why it was dafka about this language. And then it was like, no, it wasn't being dafka about the language. It's just because we had that. It was just mirroring this, right? But it doesn't mean that shnei meluchim would definitively be permitted. It's just they used the language of tamei maleach and tahor tafel because that was the opposite of what it initially taught.
Right. So I think like one thing that's interesting about both of these sugiyot is in the end, like part of what's being discussed is about a kind of like the relationship between literary structure and legal conclusion, right? In both cases. And there's a kind of interesting, like it's interesting to me that there's already a kind of push and pull between those things around this topic. Perhaps, I don't know, kind of impressionistically, it feels to me like more so than than like the Gemaras we saw last week, which is just kind of an interesting like little note that like, yeah, what's going on with literary structure. Okay. Lexi, can I get you to read this Tosfot as well?
For sure. Okay. So it's a tahor right? That when it's the permitted thing that's salted and the forbidden thing that is unsalted, it's permitted. Lo shayach gavar v'lo tata gavar. V'afil klipa lo bai. Right. So vis-a-vis salted things. First of all, like when we say maliach karoteach, even though we say it's karoteach, like it's not legamre, right? That like vis-a-vis maliach, the idea of what is on top and what is on the bottom does not matter. And in this case that we're referring to with the tahor maliach and the tamei tafel, seemingly you don't even need to take a klipa.
Can you stop for 1 second? So what, just to spell out, assuming that we rejected this view of the Tosfot and we did think that tatagvar applied, what would we think about a case where the, let's just say the tamei tafel is on the bottom? Like, let's just spell out like what that would be.
Right, but depending on if we think this is relevant, I mean, it's hard because this is also, they're kind of bringing that in here, but it's not clear in this scenario whether anything would be forbidden just because of the whole which thing is salted. But you would theoretically think, if it's relevant, that when the salted forbidden thing, like here we're dealing with a permitted salted thing. So I'm not actually sure what our hava amina necessarily would have been here about ila versus tata gavar, because it just says
right.
But in general, we would have at least had a hava amina vis-a-vis when we do know there's some level of isser, that the isser is greater, right? That either like, you know, because we talk about, right, when we say tata gavar, we say that like with things where it can osir the entirety, it's osir the entirety, as opposed to when the usr thing is on top and it's only kedei klipa, right? And it's complicated because we talked about with our roteach, that only really becomes so relevant vis-a-vis when something's mepapeah.
Good.
So yeah, there's a lot of moving parts.
There's a lot of moving parts, and I think that's actually what's important to recognize here is that like the hava mina of the Tosfot that they're like coming to dispel in this comment is like not super, at least to me, was not super obvious, because yeah, it seems like if it's really kiroteach, then like we're only talking about like these mefafea cases which are more complicated. I guess like one option is to say if the tahor thing is on tahor maliach is on top, tamei tafel is on the bottom, then we assume that it's like as if it weren't maliach at all. Like that seemed to be one way to think about like if we thought tata gavar, because the bottom is kind of the governing entity, but assuming
tata gavar is about the heat, so the analogy would be like the salt. So like the
right, exactly. So
that would be still osir, but anyway, it's osir. Yeah.
I guess the question, right? So if tatagvar is about heat and we kind of analogize from heat to salting,
right. So
then the saltedness is
because
based on whatever's on the bottom.
I think where it's coming in, right, is that with tata gavar, the whole point is that whichever thing is on the bottom, if it's hot, there's this thing that happens basically, right? Whether it's the isser that's on the bottom that's hot or the heter that's on the bottom that's hot. So you might have thought that like, if we have similar principles, I think it's almost, they're saying like, you might have thought that we had a similar principle to tata gavar vis-a-vis like how salt works in general, but it's not just about like which thing is in which position, it's just like, right? So they're saying that's actually like the logistics don't apply to Maliach, right? Which gets out, I forget which Rishon says this, but like one of them talks about the fact that like Tatak Avar is mostly talking about something small falling into a big thing, right? That's
Right,
a general like,
exactly.
vision, and that's just not as relevant with the things touching each other that are salted.
Great.
I think
Okay.
the case where you would have a nafkamina is that if like it's the tahor salty thing on the bottom and then the tameh unsalty thing at the top, if we did say tatagavar, then we would say that the tahor salty thing makes the tameh thing salty and then allows it to be oser the tahor thing, whereas the way
Yeah.
we do hold it doesn't, because it's the tameh thing is not salty. But Joel is gonna say otherwise.
No,
Go ahead, Joel.
I think you're right. I think the pushback the Tosfot would be that, which it's the Ramah, I think, who follows the tradition that does push back on this, right? Which is that, well, no, because the Tosfot, I think, is understanding like this Gemara is just a general case. So it seems to be in all cases, no matter geometrically where they are, if the Tahor, it's about which of them is salted, not about where their position is geometrically, according to this Gemara. And I think the Tosfot, someone would push back against the Tosfot would say, well, no, this is just talking about the Stam case where the two are next to each other, right? And if we change the geometry to be a vertical geometry, then you're going to get yourself into some interesting questions that have Tatagavar come back. But the Tosfot is really reading this as like applies to all cases geometrically, and that this is where Roteach Katsali doesn't really fit.
I do think it also just like makes sense, right? As in, like, if we think about Tatagavar as being not just a formalistic principle, but something that is based on a certain physical reality, right? And again, of also often like the way heat spreads, and also again, what it normally means for something to be falling onto another thing, right? Like the drop that splashes onto X, or the like, thing that falls into the pot, right? It makes sense that the hot thing on the bottom is what sort of like determines general status. Whereas like, if I have two salted things, or a salted and unsalted, like just like kind of solids that are touching each other, it just seems like completely unmoored from reality to say that which one is on top would really make a difference as to how that flavor spreads.
I mean, I don't know. It seems to me like, right, if part of what salting does is like lead things to exude their juices, like those juices drip down, they don't drip up.
Well, right, but that's about like the juices themselves, but not about how much something can be like mavlia or maflit.
I mean, yeah, I just think that like if the way part of what drips down in the juices is also the salting, it's like a brine, right?
But if anything, that would make it be like ila gavar would be the hava amina with
Well, right. I guess that's part of what I'm saying is like one, you might think that there's sort of two versions here. One way is to say Maliach is really kiroteach, and that means that all of the rules of roteach apply, including tatagvar. One option is to say this doesn't apply at all, right? The kind of geographical location is just not relevant. And one is to say, no, like the Tatagvar was about a kind of physical reality, and now like maybe there's a physical reality where they're like, oh yeah, Tatagvar. I didn't see anyone like say that. Maybe somebody does, but it just seemed to me that like the kind of intuitive physical explanation here is that like brine drips down, it doesn't go up, right? Whereas heat goes up. I don't know.
But I think that would lead you to make a distinction between which is on the top or the bottom, between Isur and Heter, rather than between Maliach and Tafer.
Right. It would. And what I think that maybe, right, that doesn't seem to be how anybody reads it. So maybe I'm just going a little too rogue here. Okay, Lexi, we did the initial first line with Tosfot, but we didn't actually talk about what the Tosfot really talks about.
You don't even need a klipa when you have this case of tahor maliach with metafel. Right, so like even though in general, again, even in the Ila and Tatagavar paradigm, we say even when the forbidden thing, like when the top thing is what's hot, we say that there's still need a klipa because there's like, while it cools down, there's still some amount of absorption that happens. And they're saying, no, in this scenario, that just actually doesn't even apply at all, right? When it's the tahor thing that's maliach, there is just not enough meaningful absorption at all to even require a klipa. And now they get to the real kind of nafkamina of this, which is
this is the real fun.
מותר לעשות בהם גבינות לישראל ולמוכן בתוכן right, that like the cheese molds that non-Jews use, we can use them without koshering them, and like can like salt our cheeses in them, because it's like a case of the tahor maliach, aka your salty cheeses, and the tamei tafel, which is the like tefusim themselves. In shayach malicha be'etz, the lonasa etz roteach al yedei malicha, right? Like malicha isn't relevant to wood slash kalim, seems to be the more broad extension, right?
Great.
And like
Yeah.
the wood that these are made in doesn't become roteach. Like they're saying the whole thing that happens between two foods, right? They're kind of bringing in multiple arguments, right? They're following this up from the Ila Tata Gavar thing, but it seems like actually the car of their argument is really that just like malicha doesn't really apply to kalim. It doesn't really make kalim exude things in the same way.
Exactly. Or at least, right, at least I think there's an interesting, at least these like cheese molds, which I think are wooden, right? So like maybe we might think that like metal or you know, other kinds of materials might be different, but yeah, at least,
right.
and we're gonna
We
see some people
also-
read it just like all kalim.
Right,
all
which
the
also
time.
because they follow up with this next example, right? Umasim b'chol yom de melech b'ka'arash mishamshin b'basar olchim menu l'tet menu b'chalav machmir tavo bracha. Right, that they also mention, right, that like people leave salt in a like basari kli, right, and take some of that salt and put it in a dairy dish, and it's fine, right? And they don't even say what kind of kara this is. I do think it's like fair to at least learn out from the way the Tosfot are understanding this, that like even though they say eights, it seems, unless they're being dafka about like these being wooden karot, it seems
Doesn't
like in
seem
general
like
they're
it.
saying that like, yeah, like this whole concept of maliach and how it makes something exude flavor and make absorbed flavor just doesn't apply to for like either asr kalim or bisari halavi kalim.
Great. So I think there's sort of two, right? If we're thinking about the comparison between maliach and roteach, in this Tosfot we get at least two ways in which it might diverge, right? The first is tatagvar doesn't apply. And then the second would be, it seems like when things are hot, they transfer flavor to vessels. But here, that doesn't happen with salting. So that's another way in which we've seen a kind of divergence, at least for the Tosfot.
Well,
We
right,
get
not
to
just
the-
about transferring flavor to the vessels, right, but about like the expelling, right? They're like, there's not enough happening here that like you can have salt then draw flavor out of a vessel to.
Great. So I think when we're going to see a couple cases in the Beit Yosef, and then also like it comes back in the Ramah where and maybe we'll even get to, there's a little pre-megadim that I think is actually really useful about whether this is about what goes in or what comes out or both or neither. So let's like pin that, because I think it's an important question of like, or are they saying nothing, there's nothing to see here, folks, nothing went in and nothing came out, which seems to be implied by them saying that this is like a case where the tamei, like tamei tafel, like I was sort of thinking that tamei tafel implies that like the salted usher cheese like doesn't go in. So you might think it doesn't go in, or you might think it doesn't go out, or maybe both. So let's just leave that kind of on the table, because I think we'll see some different cases that will help us think about that.
Can I have just a question back to the Gemara, because did we finish the Gemara? We didn't finish it, right? Like at least because we ended up saying that if both of them are salted, then it's shari, right? Like, but it seems to be actually, is it refuted in the end, or is it just left open?
Well, we ended up with the a discussion about whether we're the Reisha is actually talking about a case of both are salted or not, right? And I think we ended up, Lexi sort of led us through all of those steps, so that we end up saying that in fact, right, Tanya Reisha tahor maliach v'tamei tafel, Tanya nami seifa tamei maliach v'tahor tafel.
Exclusively answer one way or another, but it like responds to the attempts to prove that shtei meluchim must be mutar, it like explains how you don't have to read that into the Mishnah.
Right. So
Right.
in the end,
So
I
it-
think we're not going to get a conclusive answer about
So
whether
that's what I was
shtei
asking about.
meluchim
Great,
are
thank you.
mutar.
And that was in order to reconcile it with Rava at the beginning or someone, right?
Is it Rava? Yeah. No.
Yeah, I think there was Rava.
Yes. Good. Okay. Jacob, are you twirling your pen or trying to say something? Not trying to say something. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, just twirling my pen distractedly. Sorry.
That's totally, no, it's absolutely fine. Just, it's always just want to know if you have something to say. Okay, great. Other thoughts or questions about this Tosfot before we move on? Okay, great. Good. All right. I think, how are we doing on time? I think maybe we'll skip the Rambam. I think we'll see enough of the Rambam as we go. Actually, no, maybe let's just do Yud Zayin and we won't do Yud Chet. Okay, Andres, you want to read the Rambam?
Yes. אין מולכים חלבים עם הבשר, ולא מדיחים חלבים עם בשר. וסכין שחתך בחלבים, לא יחתוך בבשר. וכלי שהדיח בו חלבים, לא ידיר בו בשר, לפיכך צריך הטבח להתקין 3 סכינין, אחת ששוחט בה, ואחת שמחתך בה בשר, ואחת שמחתך בה חלבים. So what is the Rambam saying? He's saying you shouldn't salt milky things with meat, and you should neither wash חלבים together with meat, and the knife you use for milk, you should.
I think it's about fat.
Oh, sorry, it's about fat? Okay,
I think so.
okay. So the second that you use for
For
Okay.
chaylev, like
fat,
to
you
cut,
should-
right? This is like a butcher who's cutting up a
Yeah.
cow. Or something.
You shouldn't use it for basar, and that's why they have 3: one for the shechita, one for fat, and one for meat.
Great. So I think the main thing we want to see here is like, it seems like for him, you can't salt chaylev and meat, and that's kind of just straightforwardly true without kind of a lot of qualification. Cool. All right. So let's go into the tour. We're not going to see all of these things, but I'm going to try to at least start. So if you open up your tour, I'll stop screen sharing because we don't really need the screen share for this. And we'll start with Yud in the tour. The numbering, as Lexi pointed out last week, is a little strange, but we can figure it out. Okay. So can I get someone to read us starting at Tet in the tour? Alan, go ahead.
After raising my hand, and I realized that, as you said, the numbering is strange. So I have Tet Aleph.
Yeah, Tet Aleph.
Yeah.
Umaluch.
Matluach shehem maluach, ad she'ena nechal nechamat melcho. Right. So when it says maluach, it's saying up until the point when it's so salty you can't even eat it anymore. Far pirashti shir meichato behocha pasar b'chalav dina karateach umat. And I've already explained that the amount of salting in laws of basar v'chalav, its ruling is like something that is rateach, and it does expel.
Great. I think it's just literally, right, given the kinds of concerns we just saw, like it's notable that he has to say keroteach umafli. He has to say both things, right, and not just one, because I think there's something at stake for him in specifying that. All right, keep going.
He's concerned here with the shiur. What is the shiur of salt that creates the status of roteach? And it's this amount that it's not eaten because of its salt, as opposed to the amount that you would salt food with.
Right. So you might just think that, right, because otherwise, if it were the case that the shiur was less than that, you might think that, the amount of salt I put in my chicken soup just to make it taste good would be salting. But no, this is like an amount of salting that's like really significant to cause it to exude stuff and like create a brine or something like that. Great.
Right. And that amount of salt, it doesn't actually make everything usher. It's just you just need to take the peel off.
Okay, do what's here is good as well, just so we're
במטרים אומרים שאיסר והתר שניהם מלוכים, ואפילו האיסר מלוח והתר תפל. אבל אם ההתר מלוח ואיסר תפל ונוגעים זה בזה, לא, שאין כוח במלח שיגרום לאיסור שלא נמלח, שיפלוט, שאין בו כוח אלא להפליט מה שבתוכו. Okay, so when we just talked about the Isser being communicated with the Klipa, we were talking about a case when the Isser and the Heter are both salted, or the Isser is salted and the Heter is not. But if the Heter is the one that's salted and they're touching each other, the salt actually doesn't have the ability to cause the unsalted piece to expel. It only can cause the piece that's the salt is in to expel stuff.
great. Again, so we've seen the kind of more of this question of like directionality, which way are things rolling? Okay. Questions or observations about the tour before we press on? Lexi.
Well, this is something the Prisha notes, but it's like a little weird, especially given the Gemara we just looked at, that he says, he starts off with the Shnei Meluchin, and so that Filo Isur Meluach Heter Tafel, when Isur Meluach and Heter Tafel was addressed as the more obvious case where this applies. The Shnei Meluchin was the one we were like unsure about, and he was like, actually, it should be like a Filo Shnei Meluchin. It should be the Hefech there.
Right, and so what do you make of that? Like, do you find that like, no? Okay, Joel, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I didn't look at the Prisha, but right, if you looked at Rashi on the Chulin, we looked at Rashi, seemed to have this idea that something, when it's being maliach, is busy in pleta, busy exuding, and therefore it can't absorb, it can't do bolea, right? And so that's why the idea even is suggested that two things that are salted put together can't absorb from one to the other, because there's too many kicking stuff out. But if you imagine, if you don't think like Rashi does there, and you're just thinking that salt, like we said before, it's not about pleta and blia, it's about heat, right? It's just about, it's just hot like that. Then the two things being meluchim sounds more obvious.
See, that makes a lot of sense to me if we didn't have the Gemara, but it just seems like from the fact that the Gemara deals with this question of is it even true that Shnei Meluchin is Asur? And again, as you just said in the chat, is like inconclusive from the end. Like if it weren't for that Gemara, I think it makes sense to say, yeah, like there might be a problem, you know, the more salt you have on the more things, the more heat is generated, the more flavor is passed. But it seems to not be the assumption.
Well, yeah, I mean, perhaps what about this idea that the tour is in fact trying to go against that notion? He's trying to uproot that. He's saying, no, it's just a concept of salt creating heat, and there's no concept of things that are polet are not absorbing. He's uprooting that idea. Even, I mean, that idea comes into play when we talk about malicha with salting, with harud, when the blood is going out of something. But salting where there's no blood.
So what becomes sufficient to cause the transformation? If you say, according to what you're saying,
as long as the isser is hot, then.
And what happens?
Hot because it's salted, then it can contaminate what, for lack of a better word, what's near it. And it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter that the heter is also salty, because it's not necessarily, because he is intentionally, is what I'm saying, he's intentionally ignoring the idea that the fact that it's exuding is going to create a kula.
The heat,
that's what I'm suggesting.
The heat alone does it. That's the trick.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, or maybe even that the fact that it's exuding doesn't stop it from absorbing, right? Just like,
exactly,
right? So maybe he's just sort of cholek on Rashi altogether, right?
Or he's not posking like that Gemara's possible assumption. That's what I'm saying. Now, there's that thought in the Gemara. He's trying to go away from it.
Yavni, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I agree with Rav Lexi's point that it does seem to be against the Gemara. My guess would be that like the reason for the choice of language has more to do with the fact that we're learning about we just learned about like tseli, and so like because we're generally learning about heat, and this is by analogy, and this is sort of like connected to that's where the intuition comes from, that the more extreme case would be both of them having the agent of transfer. But I don't know.
I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so right, hot falling into cold is also a case, or cold falling into hot. All those kinds of questions are also discussed, but I don't know, maybe
That's where
they don't have the same kind of hierarchy.
Right. In heat, it's a borderline case where only one of them is hot. That's where it's like becomes questionable. Whereas in Maliach, as we saw in the Gemara, maybe at the borderline cases where both of them are.
Where they both are. Right. Right. So then that's, I mean, there's a certain way in which this approach, by saying the borderline case isn't, the borderline case is where one is salted and one isn't, that just like clarifies or kind of brings into line the analogy better than like what we had in the Gemara, if that makes sense. Right. So there's a way in which that makes things tidier. Let's say that. Okay, great. Anyone else want to jump in on this little line of thought before we go? Joel, I thought you might have had something you wanted to say. No? Okay, great. So I wanted to see just like a little snippet of Beit Yosef, which in my edition it's part of this really long one on Tet, but it's near, if you have the Shirat Devorah, it's like really just the very last bit where it says Shamati Shahayunu Hagot. Everybody find it? Yeah, okay. Who hasn't read? Ruben, maybe you could read.
I'm so sorry, like I got a cold and I'm not like,
oh, okay.
That's like
oh, sorry, I know the feeling.
Sorry, Sarah, can you say again, where is it?
So okay, in the there's this long Beit Yosef in Tet, but I want to look at just like the last, like, I don't know, 5-6 lines. In the Shirat Devorah, there's a bolded Shamati Shehayuna Hagot.
You mean just after Ela Keneged HaChelev?
Yes.
Right before it starts Yud and Yud Aleph.
Yeah. Raphael, do you want to read? Seeing as you found
it. שמעתי שהיו נוהגות הנשים שנמלח חתיכת בשר עם חלב שבו לנקרו ולחזור ולמלוח הבשר. ולא נראה, ולי נראה שאין הטעם בדבר דלמה, לא, ולא נראה, it's not plausible to do so, שאין טעם בדבר דלמה לא תעלה מליחה ראשונה דעת הוא חלב שבא מעכבה מלפלוט. וסבור הייתי שטעם מי שהורה להן כן אפשר, מפני שעל ידו שגוררין החלב נמצא שמגע למקום בבשר שלא נגעו בו המלח תחילה. ואחר כך ראיתי שטעם זה אין לו שחר, דאם כן חתיכה שנמלחה יהיה אסור לחותכה לשניים. שהרי מעשים שבכל יום שחותכים בשר אחרי מליחתו לכמה חתיכות, ולא פקפק אדם בדבר הזה מעולם. וכך מבואר בשם הרשב"א להתיר בשר שחותכים דקדק לפשטידה, ויוכיח אי לכך אין להם על מה שיסמוכו כלל.
Great. Can you summarize the case here and why what the options are for understanding it?
He's angry at a chumrah of women that actually do another melicha if they found chelev inside a basar or maluach. Possible tam say that this chumrah has, I don't know, some achiza b'metzius, that actually by extruding the chelev, you find a new piece of basar that wasn't actually maluach, and then he rejects it by the logic that actually, if you think that way, you can never actually cut basar, because like you're always exposing new parts of it that weren't like they weren't in the surface when the melach was originally applied.
Right. So if you thought that, go ahead, Yavni.
No, if you're about to explain, I have a question.
Great. What's your question?
Is I'm very confused what the issue is. Like it seems like if it's being salted with the chelev, isn't that a problem because of getting the flavor from the chelev, or is this, I'm confused.
So I think the thing is that they salt it twice, right? So the first time, כשנמלח חתיכת בשר עם חלב שבו,
Yeah.
In karo vechozer u'nleach habasar. So they do it one time, and the chaylev is in there.
Right? Isn't that then the meat has become asul because the chelev is asul?
Joel, you're shaking your head. No, explain why.
No, I think the problem here is that they're worried that they didn't salt it properly because of the chaylev.
I understand that, but I'm
right.
wondering why
I
they
don't
don't
think the
have
salt.
a
Yeah, I don't
bigger
think the salt.
problem.
I think the salt draws out the blood. It doesn't mix the chaylev flavor into the meat, I think is the idea here. Right.
But haven't we been saying the maliach hareuka roteach, and therefore, like if you salt something with its chelev, then it's asul? Isn't that?
Yeah, if it's very fatty, yes, but I assume that this is not the case of that, right? This is
Because
Right.
it's
So
kachush?
I think the idea is that this is chaylev kachush. I think that has to be what's going on. Because otherwise it seems like you would have this problem. But maybe somebody, I don't know if anyone else read this differently or had a different explanation. I'm all ears if they did. But my understanding was that it is chaylev kahush, and that their problem is they're concerned basically that like the presence of the fat is making it hard for the salt to access the meat in such a way that then it's not able to draw out all the blood.
No, I have a different explanation.
Great.
But maybe I'm not sure of it, but I'll suggest it that and it goes back to what I said before, that we're talking about salting here for the purpose of drawing out blood is maybe a lower level of salting and doesn't create heat. When we were talking about, that's what he said before, that when we create heat is at a higher level of salting where we're trying to maybe dry the meat for the purpose of storing it, a serious kind of salting. But the normal salting that we do to remove blood from meat before we cook it is not enough to create heat. And therefore here the only issue is in fact that exposing of the new side. But all right, so now here, give me some pushback against what I'm saying.
So, I mean, I think that's kind of a.
Go ahead.
Well, it's compelling on one level, which is just like, obviously we don't salt meat to the point that it can't be eaten.
Wait, no, sure we do. I mean, that's why you wash it.
But
I guess
when
we
we're
do.
salting it to get the blood out, that's the paradigm of like how
right,
like that is
right.
very much not edible.
Is it? Or Rav Nachman is saying it's that you salt it
I don't think
when you
so.
salt it to preserve it. That's when you put a lot of salt.
There's two terms that are seen. One is malicha I think it's lederech, if I remember correctly. Lederech,
To preserve it. Yeah.
Lehatsena or something like that. And the other is malicha lekadera. And malicha lekadera means salting it so that you can boil it. That's the normal salting that we do. Malicha lekadera, so that we can now cook it in a kadera.
So you're saying that
two different levels.
That level is never sufficient to like make things as if they're hot. Like no flavor transfer occurs.
Yeah,
I guess the reason I didn't like, one reason that explanation might not work is just that like, if we wanted to say that this custom makes no sense, and the reason was because this kind of salting isn't real salting, it seems like we would just say that, right?
No, that's not the point here. No, the point here is nothing to do. The point, this is completely parenthetical comment of the Beit Yosef that has really nothing to do with our topic, and it really should be over in the topic in the Simanim of Malicha. And all he's trying to say is that you obviously, once you've salted a meat, it can be as big as the entire side of a cow, and you've salted it. Once you've salted it, you're done. You don't have to re-salt it just because you expose a new edge that never touched salt. It's really just a question. There's nothing. I don't even know why. I don't understand why it's even here.
Ilana, did you want to say something? You're muted.
Maybe what Rav Nachum said, but I think like the structure of the argument is basically this reductio ad absurdum, like, you know, or ein ledavar soap, im kain ein ledavar soap, right? If you keep every time you expose a part of the meat, you think you have to salt it, then we'd never be able to cut meat into smaller pieces. And therefore, just because you remove the chaylev and therefore expose another surface, don't think that means you have to resalt. The first malicha is sufficient.
With salting, we have a principle that rov rubo kakuo. You attempt to salt everything, but if you have certainly a vast amount that's been salted, it's considered like the whole thing's been salted.
Okay, So maybe then this is just like totally unrelated to anything. It's 3:03, so maybe this is a good place to stop and take a break. And when we come back, we'll look at this discussion of the Rashba and etc. All right, 5 minutes.
It has
So
to do with the mimesis.
It does have to do with mimesis. Who hasn't read? Michael, maybe you can read Yud Aleph in the tour. V'katav harashba dafka k'shahayisur hamaluach. Michael. No, maybe not. Okay, great. Jacob, can you read?
Yeah. The Katav Harashba Dafka Kisha'is or Hamaluach Lamata Vahater Hatefa Lamala Ditata Gavar. Val im Isor Lamala Vahater Lamata Lo Bai Alec de Klipa Ditata Gavar. Zahater Suhu Lamata Mitsanin Halion the Ino Bala Alec de Klipa Adkan. So the Rashba writes, this is precisely when the salted Isser is below and the unsalted Heter is above, because the lower is stronger. But if the Isser is below, sorry, if the Isser is above and the Heter is below, you only need Klipa because Tata Gavar, and what's permitted is below. That will cool what's above, and it will only absorb to the point of Klipa.
Great. Okay, and importantly, Adkan Harashba. That's all that the Rashba has to say. Let's finish up this comment in the tour, and then we'll go back and see how the Beit Yosef is frustrated by this.
Yeah. Yoreh asked who Sover Shechum Al Yedei Meliach Oser Akol. So we see that he holds that like heating something through salting makes everything prohibited. But the Niavi Haras it's on Lo Katav Kain. The Gamma Shafilik bit in Imha Isra Lamata Olamala. Katav Rish in Chiluk given to Chama Yemelicha in Chiluk bin Tata Ila. El Bechol Inyan to Isar Meluach Mavlia Beheter Tefa.
So who else have we seen who has this view that the Tzatag Var does not apply?
Tosfot.
Yeah, Tosfot, right? So we saw that in the Tosfot, that the Tosfot also go this way. Not surprising, the Rosh agrees. Okay. Keep going.
Makom in Oser Kulo. Sin Koach Salida Alach Lavlia Elikide Klipa. Ufishas he isor Tefel Hakol Mutar. Lafilu Klipa Lo Bai. Okay, so we never prohibit all of it because of there isn't enough strength from salting to absorb, except until the point of klipa. And when the isser is not salted, everything's matar, and you don't even need klipa.
Great. So can you just summarize for us as the tour has it, what's the machloka between the Rashba and the Rosh and the Ri, and brackets also for the Tosfot?
So the Rashba holds that salting can, if the isser is salted on the bottom, that makes everything isser, and it so Tata Gavar does matter. The Rush So.
And then and there's the possibility that it can be Oser Hakol.
Yeah.
And
if not, it's just like Oser Kedei Klipa.
Right. So the Rosh and the Ri are going to say both Tatagvar does not apply, and then we're going to go from there to saying that that it can only be Oser Kedei Klipa.
Right.
Great. So that's the Machloket Rosh, Ri, and Rashba that the Tur sets up. The Beit Yosef is not pleased about this and thinks that there's basically that this is an incomplete citation of the Rashba. So maybe, Joel, I haven't asked you to read, so maybe you can read Yud Aleph, V'katava Rashba Dafka Kashaz or Maluach.
All right. V'katava Rashba Dafka Kasha Yisra HaMaluach Lamata V'chulei. Yireshu Sover Dechol Ma'idei Maliach Oser Kol. V'Arni Avi Arosh Zal Lo Katav Chen. Lo Katav Ken. I want to just bang on something. V'Met She'ani Tamal Rabim. Shirat Chilati V'Rashba V'lo Yispik La'ayin B'Sofam. Ad Shekatav Alav Ma Shekatav. Right. So I'm like shocked. He didn't read the whole thing. We've seen there's no machloket between the Rashba and the Rosh. Bechach. Sharei zeloshona b'torat habayit. All right. Aldin basar shchuta sheim lachim basar nevela. V'dag torshim mlacho im dag tameh. Shasrim b'shishnehem luchim. Right. So when you have the basar shchuta and basar nevela, or you have a kosher and non-kosher fish, and if they're both salted, it's oser shnehem, or b'shetameh maliach v'tohor tafel, or if it's what we saw, the tameh is the salted one. So really, the sufficient condition is that the tameh is salted in order to be oser. Okay. Dvarim elu shamarnu yireli dafka b'shaya tameh maluach lamata, and the Rashba says that's only though when the salted isur is on the bottom. Vatahor atafel lamala, and the unsalted tahor is above. Lefishach taton gover umechamem et alyon, right? Because we have the power comes from the bottom substance, it heats the top. Umavlio, and it forces it to absorb. Aval im haya hatahor hatafel lamata vatameh maluach lamala eno oser tatachton ela kedei klipa. All right. But if we have the opposite case, all we get is kedei klipa, just like we saw in the cases of Bishul with Bishul and Sali with this case. So, okay, we've made the Ramarim. Kishat tamesh shamen lefisha shuman mefa'afeh, right? V'afil aydei sali v'afil aydei melicha, right? V'nivla b'chol ha'eter v'oser kulo. Elim ken yesh bo shishim shel heter keneged kol ha'isur. All right, so this is all only if that Isur that was down below is shamen, and then it has the power to completely, give Isur throughout the entire heter, unless the heter is 60 against that.
Right. So just to jump in for 1 second. So already this version of the Rashba has made sort of like two okimtas, right? It's gotten narrower in two respects. It has to be, the orientation has to be a certain way, and the salting has to be a certain way.
Yeah.
Just so we see that. And that's not what the Torah had.
Yeah, he's left all these details out so far, right? He's just
exactly
the setup case that he mentions Tata Gavar essentially in this case. All right. And I lost my place. I apologize.
Wait, sorry, could you say that again? What are the akimtas that he's added to what the tool had?
Can I try, Sarah? Is that
yeah, go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, so he says it's he says first off the Isur has to be maliach when it has to be the salted one, but it has to be on the bottom, right? Otherwise it's not oser. If that was on the top and the tahor thing was on the bottom, it fell on it, that would only be kedei klipa.
I thought that was exactly what the Rashba did say in the tool.
That's what he says.
Then said that the others.
Yeah. That's what he says in the Torah. But what he adds in is he says that's only if it's shamen, right?
Right. That okimta.
Right. Okay. Sorry. So there's only you're right.
Yeah. Yeah. And if it's not shamen, then it's just kedei klipa, right? So, okay. I'll say like kedei klipa. Lefisha ein bo koach lefafea. So I may have skipped a little bit. I'm saying aval im eina tameh shamen alpha pishuhu lamata v'atahor lamala ein oser ela kedei klipa לפי שאין בו כוח לפעפע, לא ידע צלי ולא ידע מליחה, לפי שאין המליח כרותח של מבושל, אלא כרותח של צלי, עד כאן לשונו. So, that's the whole rashba there, right? So it has to be on the bottom and fatty and salted. It has to be all those conditions in order to need 60 against it. So, all right, Hari Mufurash, Shalo Amar Dechom Ayde Maliach, Oser Kol, Ela Davka, he's going to get a nice summary here, Kashe Isur Shamen. Uvahala Rosh Nami Oser Kol, Kedashkechan Bigdi Shamen Shislo Bechalbo. Right. We saw another place where we saw this earlier, I think, in this Siman, right, which was the from the case in the Gemara, that when you salt fatty meat, that it spreads the Isur all over the place. In that case, it was a case of you did it with its chalev, right, as we have here. And we hold, the Rosh quoted this, that maliach, that salting is like the heat of roasting. And the Torah wrote this right here. Ugdola mizo katav de'afilu isur kachush im heter shamen kol echad isur maliach veheter tafel oser kulo. Right, and even more so than this, right? He wrote that even if the isur itself is right, this was the thing that drove us nuts in the last shir, right? I mean, was supposed to drive us nuts. That the isur is lean, and the heter shamen, right? If the Isur is Maliach and Heter is Tafel, that it still managed to Osir Kulon, right? The Beit Yosef goes nuts trying to figure out if this Recha Miltahi or whatever it may be that's going on here. And then people go nuts on the Beit Yosef about it. Uchvar Pirashti, Dekeshein Boshishim, Kamar, right? De Osir Kulo. And then I said when it says Osir Kulo, it's only when there's not 60. Bechach Pirush Divrei Harashba, Mikol Makom Niparer Shedivrei Harashba Bazeh. Muskamin ladat rosh ladat rabino. Proof that that there's that this agrees with the Rashba, agrees not only with the Rosh but agrees with the Torah himself in other places here. So the Rashba is not actually a machlok with anybody. He just needed to read the entire Rashba. That the Rashba was talking about a very particular case that actually matches up with all the other cases we've said before. So it's
beautiful. So we've sort of found a way to harmonize what apparently is this or at least to make sense of. Not to make sense of misreading, but at least to make the misreading be productive in some kind of way. So while we're on this, I think it's actually useful just to skip ahead to the Taz, who has also a kind of way of thinking about this question. So we want to see the Taz on, it's Taz Kaf Zayin, it's on Seif Yod Aleph. Okay. Yavni, maybe I could get you to read. Maybe actually, if you could just read the Yod Aleph in the Shulchan Aruch, and then we'll look at Yesh Cholkin V'Omrim D'Melicha in Chiluk. Sorry to kind of jump around, but I think it's actually more useful because that's like the Taz is gonna find another way to read the tour.
All right. זה שאמרנו, that part?
Yeah.
באיסור מליח והיתר תפל, שאם הוא שמן, אוסר עד שיהיה בו 60 לבטלו, דווקא כשהיה איסור המליח למטה והיתר תפל למעלה, משום דתת הגבר. אבל אם היה היתר תפל למטה והאיסור המליח למעלה, אינו אוסר אלא כדי קליפה. ויש, the Rama adds, so that was what the Rashba said, not like the Tosfot, even though, right, he was able to harmonize part of it, but I don't think he harmonized this part. Anyway.
Right. So right, exactly. So this is, the Mechaber here is going like the Rashba.
Right. To say that we do have Tata Gavar in the case of Maliach Shamen.
Exactly.
הרמה says, ויש חולקים ואומרים, דמליחה אין חילוק אם הוא למעלה או למטה, והכי נהוג. And the Rama holds like the Tosfot, that Beautiful. We don't have Tata Gavar.
Okay. So now I want to look at Kaf Zayin in the Taz, because he's got a kind of different reading of how to think about what the Tur is doing with the Rashba.
Okay. Should I start from
Start from the beginning, yeah. Yeah, start from the beginning. I think it's okay.
ויש חולקין ואומרים דמליכה אין חילוק וכולי. הטעם דבמליכה אין כוח באותו, הטעם דבמליכה אין כוח באותו שהוא תפל לבטל כוח המליכה. וכן אין כוח במליכה לעשות התפל מליח. כי כן דרך המליח שדאינו יכולה להתבטל כי אם על ידי הדחה. כך כתב הסמ"ק. So the reason for the Tosfot's understanding is that with salting, there's no strength in the non-salty thing to cancel out the saltiness of the salty thing, i.e., even if it is underneath, it will still, it's not going to make the non-salty, it's not going to cool off the salty thing. And similarly, there's no strength in the salty thing to make something that's not salty salty, because that's the way of saltiness, that it's not able to be nullified except through washing it off.
Wait, can I jump in here for a second?
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting what he's saying here, because he's giving us a nice explanation, because we would have thought that, like, I mean, it's very obvious really what he's saying. That the whole idea of Tata Gavar is that, like, that they're both off the fire. They're not on the fire. They're off the fire. And now, if the bottom one is hot, it's got some residual heat that can heat up the top one. But right, if they're on the fire, then we don't talk about Tata Gavar. But this is a case where they're salted. Now, if they're salted, it's like they're on the fire, because that salt is constantly acting as a heating agent and heating it up. And it can go on for hours like that. So there's no meaning to the idea of one warming up the other or cooling down the other, because they're in the fire. That's what he's saying. And as long as I have the floor for a moment, I'll just correct myself. What I said before was I checked in Siman Sadi Aleph, and yes, you guys are all right. The malicha that we do for La Kedera is enough to transfer heat. So we are talking about that. So that case that we saw before that I mentioned that Sarah had us read, where the Beit Yosef seems to say, you maybe need to salt it again, you don't need to salt it again. It is a good question. You must have to say that the meat was not fatty, and therefore you only need to take klipa off. You must have to say like that. You're gonna have to say like that that the meat was not fatty, and therefore, and even though it was salty, the chelev only forbid a klipa. And once you take that off, once you take a klipa of the meat off, you don't have to salt it again. And that's what he's coming to say. But just back to saying here, it's he's saying a very good point. There's no meaning to kata gavar when you have salt, because the salt is like it's on the fire. All right, thank you. That was my stealing a little bit of your time.
Thank you. No, but very helpfully so. Okay, great. So Yavni, can you keep going? Because now he's going to get into the Beit Yosef. Beit Yosef.
I should skip I don't think I.
Oh, sorry. Did I? No, I sorry, I didn't mean to skip ahead. You were right.
ובטור כתוב בפשט זה, וזה לשונו, יראה שהוא סובר שחום על ידי מליח אוסר הכל, כולי. So that's just quoting the tool and saying that, like, this argument about the Tata Gavar implies, because we say only Kedei Klipa, if it's in the, like, lenient case, that implies that in the stringent case, it would be the whole thing. והקשה בית יוסף, הכתב הרשב"א עצמו שם, אחר זה שמיירי דווקא בשמן, כולי. And the Beit Yosef challenge and say that the Rashba himself says that that's only for the case of a fatty thing. וצריך כל מעיין לחפש בכל כוחו להצדיק דברי רבינו הטור, מקושייה תמוה כזאת, שהעתיק ראשית הדברים ולא סופן. And the Taz says that anyone who is studying this should try with all their might to explain the tool from this kushya of the Beit Yosef, that the tool chose to copy only part of the words of the Rashba.
Right. So in other words, he's going to say, like, the level of reconciliation we got out of the Beit Yosef is kind of insufficient. We really need to understand why someone as wonderful as the Torah would have left this out. So now he's going to try to give you an explanation of what's going on.
וראיתי תיקונים על זה, מה דלא ניחא לי כלל. And I saw some explanations or some, explanations of this that didn't satisfy me at all. והנראה לעוניית דעתי בזה שדעתור דקדק מדברי הרשב"א שחילק בין האיסור מלוח למעלה או למטה. שמע מינא דטעם הדבר שאסור כולו באיסור שומן הוא, מפני שההיתר עצמו נעשה כולו רותח, ועל ידי זה הוא מקבל טעם איסור שהוא שומן.
Okay, why don't you stop there and explain before we keep going?
And it seems, in my humble opinion, that that the tool was being precise in the words of the Rashba, who said, who was making a distinction between the salty isur being on top or on the bottom. And we learn from that he learned from that the reason for the matter is that the isur, the asur kulo באיסור שומן הוא מפני that the reason that that the reason that it ushers the whole thing in the case of a fatty thing is because the heter itself becomes all of it like it's hot. And that way it receives the isur, it receives the isur, which is fatty.
Okay.
Something like that.
Yeah. I think that's right.
אבל הטור לא מפרש כך, אלא אף על פי שההיתר הוא צונן, מכל מקום השומן שהוא בא מאיסור מלוח, הולך ומפעפע בהיתר, אף על פי שהוא צונן. But the Tur disagrees with the Rashba on this because he holds that even if the heter is cold, in any case, the fat in it, wait, the
Isur Maluach is going to spread around.
The
even if it's cold.
is going to spread around because it's fat.
So I think.
Oh, even if it's cold, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
right, even though it's cold because it's salty, it's going to spread out. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. Even though it's so, but I think when he says, he doesn't mean na'aseh kulo actually roteach. He means na'aseh kulo ki roteach. And that is the explanation for why we do this. But so it's like it's a conceptual disagreement that the Tur has with the Rashba. The disagreement is the Rashba thinks that the reason it would be Oser HaKol is because it turns into something that is as if it were hot.
Right.
And the Tur is, I think what he's trying to say is you don't need to go so far as to say it was as if it were hot. There's flavor transfer, even if we're not saying that the salting of one object is enough to make the other thing as if it were hot. There's like there's enough kind of koach just without saying it's all the way roteach. It's like still tzonein. That's how I read that. I don't know if other people. I found it kind of confusing. I don't know if other people had other ways of explaining it that might be clearer, which I would be very happy to hear. Joel.
And his last bit is ki ha'pe'apua ba'atzmo roteach because the spreading out itself is hot.
So I think I think it's like whatever gets spread by the malicha is that spread, the salty fat is hot. In quotes. But that doesn't mean the whole thing is hot. It's just that the salty spready stuff is hot, I think. Joel.
No, I was going to say, because
you can clarify here.
Well, no, I think it's worth adding the way that Taz is going to present it, if I remember correctly. Like he said, at first blush, it's not obvious there's a difference between these two cases, right? It's like in one way or the other, the Shiman is going to spread, right? Either between the way he's conceptualizing it or the way the Rashba is conceptualizing it. But then the Taz is going to give us why there actually is a difference between those two things, right? That there actually is a nafka mina between those two concepts. And that's the important part of this in that sense.
Right. So he's right, because he's going to say that there's enough kamina about whether it's like an is or don't, right? or something.
Exactly, but at first blush, right, it sounds like they're the same thing. One way or the other, the fat of the bottom piece is going to end up in, oser, the top piece, whether that's
right, either because it, right, just to spell that out, either because it makes the top piece hot, that's the rashba, or because what comes out of the bottom piece is hot, and that spreads around, has no effect on the temperature, in quotes, right? This is all like imagined temperature, but the temperature of the top thing, that's the tour. In either case, there's a transfer. So then what's the nafkamina?
Right. Wait, so just to go back to the tool, he's saying that the tool, when the tool says Yoreh shehu harashba sover shechom al yedei maliach oser hakol, what the Taz is being medayek is he's saying he's saying davka the chom al yedei maliach is what's oser hakol, as opposed to the piapua of the shuman that is oser hakol. Like, he's saying the Rashba thinks that the whole thing gets hot from the maliach, as opposed to that the fat is able to spread to the whole thing. Because
or that the fat that spreads is hot and affects this transfer, as opposed to making the whole object hot.
Okay.
Which I guess, I mean, we're gonna see one potential nafkamina. I mean, I don't know if anyone wants to try to generate another one, but
I mean, the obvious one seems to be that whether tata gaval or not, right? That's still a different, anyway, right?
Yeah, because you would think, right? Because the if it's hot, if it's really hot, then we like have principles for how we deal with things that are hot. And if it's only the piapua that's hot, or like as if hot, then maybe tatagvar isn't as useful, in part because like we're now talking about a like spreading liquidy exusion rather than two objects, one stacked on top of the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. But I think it's like just worth noting, it's a little bit of a strange distinction in the logic, but I think again, it like goes back to this question of like, what does it mean for something to be like something else, right? And like how much of Yoreh are we importing and in what way?
Just to review here, and extract this from the context of Malicha. If we're saying is that the hot pipua that is the spreading agent, and not the chum of the chaticha. If let's say you have two cold chaticha next to each other, but the fatty substance within it is hot, can that spread if the piece itself is not hot?
It's just hard to imagine how that would even happen. Like the fatty exusion is hot, but the
right, it's
thing isn't. Alan, we lost you for a second. Can you say that again?
I'm gonna think about it, what I meant.
Okay, I don't know if other people have a thought about this, right? There is something kind of implausible about what this would be, but I think one thing that might make a difference is that if you think that what's going on is the top thing just gets hot, then the top thing has to be able to absorb. But if you're in this view where things that are salted or as if salty are always exuding and can't absorb, then if it's just the hot exusion that's traveling around, doesn't matter what's going on with the top thing, really. All that matters is that the hot exusion is going around. So maybe it doesn't matter if Joel?
But I think that, and maybe we'll do it in a second, but the Taz is going to say that really the nafkamina isn't about two pieces, it's about a single piece, right? At the end of the day.
Right. Okay. So let's see the nafkamina now. Yavni, you wanna keep going?
ונפקא בין שני טעמים אלו, דאילו לטעם הרשב"א שהוא רותח, משמע דאילו בחתיכה אחת, משמע דאילו בחתיכה אחת שבולעת איסור דאורייתא על ידי מליחה נאסרה כולה, כיוון שמליחה של איסור שומן עושה רותח את חתיכת ההיתר. הוא הדין נמי בכחוש בחתיכה אחת. Okay, let me. So according to the Rashba, that it's like really roteach, it means that if the if you had one chaticha which had absorbed an isur deoraita through the process of salting, then the whole thing would be asur, because the salting of something of the shuman fat. I guess the isur deoraita was also fatty.
Yeah, I think that we're just assuming that.
Okay. Then it's like it makes it roteach. The chaticha v'teroteach, and that would also be true even if the, I guess the heter is kachush with one chaticha. It's like one, even if it's kachush.
Right. So either way, you have a single piece, and then something asur is bolea into something asur deoraita is bolea into that.
Yeah.
Even if it's shamin, or even if it's
kachush, whether it's shamin or kachush, דלא הצריכו שומן אלא מחתיכה לחתיכה דאינה בולעת בkachush. And because we only required it to be shuman when it's going from one chaticha to another, which isn't, in which case it's not going to absorb in the case of a kachush thing. אבל בחתיכה אחת ודאי פולטת מה שבולעת בכל חלקיה כיוון שהיא רותחת. But with one piece, then it surely exudes what it absorbs in all its among all its pieces, I guess. Because it's
exactly
hot, i.e. salted. ועל זה אומר יראה דחום שעל ידי מליחה, ועל זה אומר יראה דחום שעל ידי מליחה דלכאורה הוא לשון מיותר. אך דחום דהיה לו לומר דעל ידי מליחה אוסר הכל. And about this, the Tur said it seems that the heat of the melicha is oser hakol, because he didn't really, because that would seem to be extraneous language to say chom, because he could have just said al yidei melicha oser hakol, but because he's characterizing the Rashba's opinion, he's saying that davka the chom of the melicha. Ela nitkaven lama lema shekatavti שמשמע, אלא נתכוון למה שכתבתי שמשמע מדברי רשב"א, החמימות המליחה גורמת להרתיח כל החתיכה, וממילא נאסרה כולה. So the Tur's explanation of the Rashba is that the heat of the salting causes the whole piece to heat up, כביכול, and therefore the whole thing gets asur.
Right. And I think the important thing is afilu b'kachush, right? So the the Beit Yosef's problem was that the Rashba seems to say that this only applies if it's shamin, and now the Taz has found a way to say that actually what the Tur is taking out of the Rashba applies even if it's kahush. And so it doesn't
specifically if it's one piece. It requires it to be shaman only if it's two. When the Rashba says only if it's shaman, that's when it's two pieces. But it does happen if it's kahush, if it's one piece.
Joel?
Yeah, I think he's still talking about a two-piece case here, right? He's talking about a case, let's imagine this, right? You have an isur kahush, right? That heter kahush that has like some pork juice drops on it or something like that, and it drops on a piece that's salted, right? If you just think, right, that the piece can be the heter, it almost doesn't matter, right? And then the question is, does the salt of the bottom thing make the top piece roteach? So now it spreads that isur that was already absorbed in it all around the piece or not? That's the nafkamina of this whole thing. Does the bottom piece heat the top piece so that, let's say there was something balua in it, it can now spread that thing that was balua in it around the whole thing or not? Before it was just cold. It's just like a piece of meat with some pork juice on top of sitting on top of it. But now it says hot piece with pork juice sitting on top of it because it touched something that was maluach on the bottom. And it's like a very confusing case here that the Taz is bringing. But it's
Are you sure, Joe?
I'm not 100% sure.
I thought when he said, I thought he was just saying that it's one piece that absorbed some isser, and you might have thought that it would only usher it at the location of where it fell, like Kedei Klipa or Kedei Netila. But because it's salty, that whole piece now is going to become asur, because it's like it's boiling. It's like it's in a pot being boiled. So the saltiness makes that drop that hit one side spread everywhere. I thought that's what he was saying.
No,
and that there's a functionality of, and then he's trying to distinguish between two different functionalities. One is the functionality of salt, which salt causes a piece to heat up and therefore spread whatever it's got in it all around. And there's another functionality, which is fattiness. And fattiness allows flavor to go from one piece to another. Something like that. No, am I missing? I don't know.
No, that was my first take, but he's got that weird language, and maybe I'm wrong, but he's got that weird language of, right? Kevan shemlicha shel isur shuman, oser rotech chatichat isur, right? Hu adinami bekachush, bechaticha achat, right? So I was understanding that he may even have two pieces in there. It may not make a difference. It might work for both cases in his kind of physics here.
Wait, spell out how it might not make a difference.
Well, in other words, in both cases, it could just be where I have an isur, a heter rather, that has some pork juice on it, and I salt it, and now the whole thing just heats up and it spreads that isur all over it. Or even if it lands on something salty, it does the same thing, right?
The piece with the pork juice.
Yeah. So. But in either case, it becomes a salty, the salt heats it up, shall we say. And,
but wouldn't I need shuman in order to, wouldn't I need some sort of shamnunit to spread things from one piece to another in the second case?
Not if it's heated. I mean, if you...
oh, I see. So if I think, so there's a nafkamina there. So if I think like the Rashba, I think that the malicha is heating, then I think that I don't need shamnunit at all.
Yeah, so... But I mean, you still, right, anything that's sali, you still need to spread it all over. The piece itself has to be, right, how much it spreads depends on how fatty it is in the piece itself, I guess. So
right, but assume that the first piece is, well, right, so then I have to assume that the first piece is fatty anyway.
Oh, no, because an isur in it, the isur itself, right, if it's like a liquid isur, could spread all over the piece.
Could spread all the way through, right? So it just has to be liquid isur onto the solid, and then goes into the hot piece.
Yeah. So this was remember, if we saw in Yud, I don't know if people remember this, back in Sif Katan Yud, the Taz had this whole physics of like what happens, with different pieces in terms of tzli, right? Like where they can be. What was that? There's a picture?
Nothing.
Oh, okay. I was telling Rav Nachum about a picture of it. That'd be really great. But it's physics of it, right? But he said essentially like, right, two pieces only, there's rules like shuman can only go from one piece to another if it's really fatty, and how much can it go and all that. He had all these rules, but he said within a piece itself, things can spread an isur can spread all over, right? So potentially, but an isur bubble, that is.
What do people think of this like attempt to read the tour? Like, is this convincing? Is this crazy? Like, what do you make of it?
Can you go back and look at the tour and show us how he reads the tour in the tour?
I can try. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it, but I can give it my best shot. Okay, so let us turn back to the tour. And we want to be okay, so we want to be on Yud Aleph, right? Actually, maybe I'll back up to Yud because I think that's kind of helpful. All right, Michael, do you want to read this for us again? And maybe we'll work together to try to read it back.
במה דברים אמורים? שהאיסור וההתר, שניהם מלוכים, ואפילו האיסור המלוח וההתר טפל. אבל אם ההתר מלוח והאיסור טפל, ונוגעים זה בזה, לא. שאין כוח במלח שיגרום לאיסור שלא נמלח שיפלוט. שאין בו כוח אלא להפליט מה שבתוכו.
Okay. Just you don't have to translate, just summarize quickly.
Right. This applies in a case where you have like both of them salted, or a case where the Isser piece is salted, even if the heter piece is not.
Right, and just to clarify, this is asur hakol unless one of them is or sorry, it's asur kadei klipa, right?
I mean, he
That's what we're
implied something. He says, if the heter is salty and the isser, right? The isser is not salty. Well, what is it, fatty or is it not fatty?
So far, he hasn't told us, but
yeah,
we're gonna see. Okay, so let's see. Let's watch him quote the Rashba.
מכתב הרשב"א, דווקא כשהאיסור המלוח למטה, וההדר הטפל למעלה, דתתה כבר. אבל אם האיסור למעלה, וההדר למטה, לא באי אלא כדי קליפה דתתה כבר. שההדר שהוא למטה מצנן העליון, ואינו בולע אלא כדי קליפה. עד כאן.
So I feel like he's leaning on mitzanin ha'elyon, right? Yeah, Joel?
I think it's the next line that he's really leaning on too, right?
Yeah, right. Let's read the next line. Page. The page jumped.
Yeah, is that me?
Led me astray. Go ahead, read it. Yeah.
That it's the heat of the salt that's oser, right? Because heat, which is crazy because I have a note in mine, it's kaftet in mine, in it's hagot ve'harot. It says bekit ve'yad fus, whatever the fus romi, I don't know, whatever it is. Hagir say yereshu sover dekesha isur lamata oser kol. He take the other versions take out the word chom, which is the whole thing that Taz relies upon there to prove his point.
Right. Although again, that's well, but maybe that's you don't think the lemata mitzdanin ha'elyon is enough to tell you that it's about chom.
That's true. Yeah, Michael might be right there. That good point. I'll take that. So.
Right. So maybe that. Yeah. I think the idea is we're talking about the heat. Now, I guess the question is that, right, so then the tour seems to disagree that it, right, in the Taz's formulation, the Rashba thinks that this is about heat and the tour thinks this is about like other exuding stuff. But when he summarizes the other opinion, right? Ve'arunia v'arosh lo katav kain. V'gam ma shechilek bein ha'yisur lamata lamala katav ari she'ein chiluk kivan shehu cham al yedei melicha ein chiluk bein tata la'aliyah. That seems like it's also about chimum. Right? So I don't know. I don't see the other view being articulated here. I see that he thinks the Rashba is talking about temperature. But I don't see the other view that the Taz attributes to the tour being articulated, but maybe other people do and they can find it, which would be great. Any takers? No.
Which other view?
The view that it's not about heat transfer at all. It's about something being exuded and that exuded thing is hot.
Oh, I see the view of the Taz's view of the tool's view.
Yeah.
Of the tool's own opinion. Got it.
Yeah, of the tour's own opinion. I don't see that. But maybe that's, I mean, maybe like I'd be very happy for someone to convince me that it's there, but I don't see it as far as I can find. Okay. Since we only have about 8 minutes left, I'd love to see the Beit Yosef on the cheese molds. So that's it's marked somewhat confusing as Yod Bet dash Yod Gimel, and then it's Velo Shaykh Molicha. It should be right there. Ilana, since you haven't read, maybe you could read for us.
Yes, but I have not found it yet. Can you say Lo Sheikh Malika? Can you say again where? I found it.
So
okay, I found it. Now I found it. Okay.
Great.
Okay. So just don't read the tour, just read the Beit Yosef.
Oh, I guess we haven't read the Tur, so maybe you could read the Tur for us as well.
Okay, so you'd bet, yeah?
You'd bet, yeah.
ולא שייך מליחה, אלא באוכלים ולא בכלי. הילקח גבינות שנעשו בדפוסי הגויים, אף על פי שנמלכו בתוכן, לא אמרינן מליח כרותח ויהיו אסורין, אלא כמו איסור טפל והיתר מליח ומותר. So malicha applies to food, but not to vessels. And therefore, if you're making, kosher cheese in molds that were used to make, non-kosher cheese, we don't say that maliach is like roteach that would aser our cheese because there's no malicha in the kli. And rather it's like the kli is an isur tafel and our cheese is the heter maliach and it's mutar.
Great. Okay, so now let's see the Beit Yosef. So just to remind us, that's like basically the Tosfot repackaged, more or less.
Just one quick observation, which is that the laws of Kalim seem to be a little bit just fuzzy and inconsistent, at least to me, right? Like we have talked about cases in which a kli, on one hand, is kind of like a chaticha, but is also kind of like a bone. In other cases, like can it absorb and
right.
flavor?
And we'll also see like is there chanan for kalim or not? Like okay,
right? It's a whole nother. It's something to put in the background.
All right. So let's see this Beit Yosef. V'lo shayach.
Okay. V'lo shayach melicha ela be'ochlim v'lo be'kli. Hilkach v'not shenasu b'tfisei goyim v'chulei. V'chein melech shehu natun b'ke'ara shel basar mutar litzno b'chalav. Which is the idea that if you have a meat dish and you have salt in it, you can then put that dish on the table and use it when you're eating dairy. I guess that's how I understood.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
כך כתב התוספות, והראש בפרק כל הבשר, אלא דמלשון התוספות משמע דלכתחילה נמי שרי, because the way we phrase the cheese thing, it sounds like b'diavad, like it's in past tense.
Yeah.
Binot shenasu, but from the Tosfot, I'm just looking back at the Tosfot, when the Tosfot talked about the umutar lasot behem gvinot liYisrael ulamochan, like it's language of lechatchila.
Exactly. Great.
Okay. Aval ha-Mordechai katav al dfusei gvinot hagoyim lechatchila asur, which would be more in line with the Tur than with the Tosfot, I guess, right? Mishum herchek min hakiur, like we don't want to have anything to do with the non-Jews cheese, I guess. Keep far away. V'kach nira midivrei harosh ve'Rabbeinu, the Tur, umihu b'melach hanatun beke'ara mashma delechadchila shari lechulei alma sheharei gam harosh v'hamordechai katvu sherigilot hu la'asot ken. So this was like common practice to use the same dishes, that you to have a salt dish that doesn't matter basically if it's, you can use it for meat meals and milk meals. The kach katav be'orchot chayim, b'shem ha'ra'a, the Bedek HaBayit, I think, kelim shel goyim shehudchu yafeh, mutar litain behem tavlin, וכן בצל וכיוצא בו חריף שאינו מוציא דבר קשה יבש ביבש. So we have this idea that consistent with what we saw in the Tur, that as long as you wash something well, even if it was used for presumably like even in nevela, anything, as long as you wash it, you can put spices in it, you can put things that are charif in it, because it's not taking anything, because a kli acts differently than food and it's not taking anything out of the kli.
Right. So just the fact that these things are like charif is not sufficient for something to be exuded from the pot. Since we don't have a lot of time, can you skip down to Katav ha'igor b'shem ashiri, which is like the next bolded part in the Shira Dvorah, just because I think this case is kind of interesting.
Yes, but I don't think I read this, but I'll read it. Okay, I didn't know where
you can do it.
Katav ha'igor b'shem ashiri, ma'aseh b'shivcha goya, shemalcha tum'a b'ke'ara, ve'achar shehisira ha'tum'a me'ke'ara, הכניסה אותה קערה במים רותחים שהיו במחבת על האש, ומאותם המים נתנו בקמח ולשו עיסה, ולא היו שישים לבטל הקערה שהייתה בת יומה.
Okay, so just explain what that case is. Like, what's she done?
Okay, what did this woman do? So you had this non-Jewish shivcha. She took unkosher meat, salted it in a dish. She then took out that meat from the dish, put the, did, I don't know, something like hagala on this dish, I guess.
No, I think she just puts boiling water in it, and then she uses that hot water to make bread.
Sorry. Okay.
That's, I think, what's happening.
So she's putting boiling water in the dish. Okay.
She's putting the dish in boiling water.
Putting the dish in boiling water. Right. Okay. In some sort of like kli rishon. Okay. And she takes the
She takes the water from there. Sorry, yes. She takes the water from there and uses it to make bread.
Okay. The water that was used to rinse the dish that had the nevela in.
Yes.
Correct? Okay. And there wasn't icy and the kara was bat yoma because it had just been used for this nevela. And there wasn't shishim to counteract anything that had been absorbed into the I guess there wasn't shishim against the volume of the dish, presumably, because that had absorbed the isur.
Right. So we're going to assume that whatever, like the maximum volume that the dish could have absorbed is the volume of the dish, and that's what we would need 60 against if we had been cooking in the initial pot. So I think what's kind of cool about this case is it isolates whether things go into the dish versus through salting versus coming out of the dish through salting, which maybe the cheese case doesn't do as well. Okay, great. So what do we want to say about it?
Oh, keep going, yeah. Okay. Ve'ata im ne'amar de kama batil, ma shenatnu ba'isa batil gam l'Rabbeinu Ephraim, Damar lo amrinan chatichat manasei nevela ela bebasar bechalav. Im ken lo ba'inan lo ba'isa velo b'mayim ela keneged ma shebalua mehatum'a bakara. Okay, I have to go back. If we say that the bitul happens like at each step, like I'm just trying to figure out what.
I think basically the water, when you add water to dough, you add it a bit at a time, so you might think that it's kama batil.
Okay, right? Okay. Each little bit of water is getting nullified as it's added in because of the proportions.
Yeah, and so that then even if you don't hold it, even if you think that there's only, even if you
I think the is misleading. I think it's Rabbeinu Ephraim, then Hanan. So we would have Hanan here, right? Then because each drop is batel, because there's not a lot of stuff that's balu in the drop, and the whole drop isn't itself
Hanan, right? Yeah. So we've taken that off the table. There's only a little bit dropping on, so then you shouldn't need to worry.
Isn't it very strange what he's saying? He's saying that the amount that's absorbed, we can say we don't have to go by the whole pot. We just go by what we guess went in, which is not the normal opinion that we would say.
Right. And so,
and then he said, but really the question that bothers us all is doesn't this seem to contradict the tour, what he said in Yud Bet, that
exactly
this is a pot and this is not food. Why is this considered boiling?
So why does
this different from the cheese?
why is this different from the cheese? Why does this even get off the ground as a question? Because if you think that, right, then like, why do I even have this issue in the first place? Right?
Well,
I think that's like the
hard
hard question.
Well, I think that was assuming that it was that it had been washed off at least. This, it seemed like she salted it, she took the meat out, and then she was washing it in that water. I don't know, maybe.
It could be a difference between basar b'chalav and nevela, that maybe we're stricter for nevela.
First of all, it could be that the Eager has a different opinion.
Could be that Eager has a different opinion, right? He just doesn't agree with this at all. He's cholek on the Tosfot. He just doesn't think this is true. Maybe we think nevela is different. Maybe she's supposed to wash it off.
Another possibility is that what I'm thinking is that it's like a sear. It's maybe different than remember we said that if you have a sear for 18 minutes in a pot, then it's like boiling. Maybe it's different than cheese where it's dry.
So one idea which I saw, I think in the Pichle Shuva, but we're not going to have time to read it, is or maybe the Pichle Shuva, the Pri Megadim. Somebody says, well, salting only causes things to go in one direction. It only causes things to go into the kli, but not to go out. And so in this case, we are worried because the salting causes things to go into the kli, but it goes out because of the hot water.
In other words, the cheese case, it was not going out because of hot water. And
the cheese case, it was going. We had salting.
It went in, but it didn't come out.
And it went in, but it didn't go out. Here, it's going out because it's hot, right? I mean, it's like really mamish hot with temperature.
And rotev.
Except that he says lo shayach malicha el. Except the Tur said lo shayach malicha ela beochli velo bekli. He didn't say it goes in one way and doesn't go out. He says it's not shayach.
Yeah.
So that answer is a bit dachuk.
Yeah. I don't know. Like, I mean, I think the simple answer is just the Igor doesn't agree. Yeah. But I think that the problem is that, like, it doesn't seem like the Beit Yosef, at least to my reading, and again, if people might disagree,
doesn't seem to notice that.
The Beit Yosef doesn't seem to say that. And so, right, like, I think if the Beit Yosef saw this as cholek on the Tosfot, he would have said that. But maybe not. I don't know. That's what I got. It's 4:05 in my East Coast time, so I will end it there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Next week is Alan, yes?
Aaron and I will be sending out
Alan and Aaron.
Correct.
Okay.
Also, Alan, I owe you an email. I'm very sorry, but I will respond to you.
I will hold my bated breath to read your publication.